Thank you, Pandalis, and to the Faculty of Classics and the Archive of Greek and Roman Drama and St. Hilda's for helping to make this, I hope, fun and educational event happen. We hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us. This is what Keats has to say about poetry, and I think maybe it's one of those reasons why didactic is perhaps among the least popular of the genres in contemporary poetry. For the one thing didactic does have is a palpable design upon us to instruct, to educate, to persuade, to change. Yet if we think about it, didactic is itself a popular genre in other forms of entertainment. Consider, for one, the cooking show, or even the recipe blog, which, like ancient didactic, might blend family genealogy, legend, and narrative into step-by-step instruction, along with gorgeous description. Consider the sumptuous vocabulary of Nigella Lawson, for instance, and a dollop of similes. My own attraction to didactic began with the Georgics in Dryden's blurb, The Best Poem by the Best Poet, a gateway drug for many poets. That led me to an interest in Lucretius and then a circling back to Hesiod. Kimberly Johnson, like me, is a US-born Generation X poet and shares this unusual interest in the didactic epic poem and has translated the Georgics, Theogony, and Works and Days. So I'm fascinated by this overlap that we have of interest. I think one of the reasons why these poems are so fun and interesting to poets is they brim with beautiful description and precise description of the natural world. They have a discursiveness, so it's in a form that can incorporate anything in the universe. So in this time of climate catastrophe, rising strongman triumvirates, and an uncertain future, it's the didactic poem, I think, that will speak to us and our concerns. So we're going to have a kind of conversation and reading. Can we use this table together? Is that the plan? So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of Kimberly's translations, discussing that problem as a poet with verse translation, problems and opportunities, I guess. One of the things that fascinated me in Kimberly's introduction to her wonderful Georgics is what she says about reading. Virgil thematizes the labor of reading throughout the poem. Book 1 provides a virtual primer for interpreting the world's legible signs. The sheer accumulation of these decoding tips suggests that decoding is itself the crucial activity. In the Georgics, all other skills are contingent on the skill of interpretation, a notion born out in the first 5 lines, where the poet who perceives his material and organizes it into coherence is a reader as well. This realization prompts a revision of our sense of the poem's didacticism. The Georgics' most persistent instruction seems to be educating its reader in the essential and difficult task of interpretation. So if you think of translating as itself a kind of close reading, this really resonated with me. So we can connect the signs, reading of signs, and the writing on the wall of that poem's difficult cultural moment, not very much unlike our own. So a big welcome to Kimberly Johnson.
I'll do something. Okay. I'm going to read some sections first before we have this conversation. It's funny that you mentioned strongman triumvirates, because as I was thinking about what I might choose to read from today, I landed on this passage and I thought, oh, it's the perfect passage to read on Inauguration Day in the United States of America. This is from the Works and Days. And it begins, "This is the race of iron." I should say perhaps that Hesiod has spent several lines, about 70 lines at this point, going through the different ages of man, from the glorious golden age in the distant past up to this kind of period that he laments that he has to live. This is the race of iron. Never by day rest from hardship and toil, ever by night languish and waste. The gods heap us with grievous cares, though even in this age some good tempers the ill. Yet Zeus will destroy this race of mortals too. When babies are born with hoary gray temples, the father will jar with his children with him. Guest will clash with host and comrade with comrade, and no love between brothers as before. Men will hold parents in sudden contempt as they age, grousing at them with rude, bitter rants, cruel, ignorant, and irreverent to the gods. They will not repay their aging parents for their nurture. Fist justified, sacking one another's cities, no regard for the oath keeper, the righteous or the good, but they will praise thugs and evildoers. Might will make right, and shame will be lost. The base will sabotage their betters, telling crooked tales and swearing them true. Envy will walk with those wretched men all, foul-mouthed, malignant, their faces etched with hate. And last, from the earth's spacious ways to Olympus, their lovely limbs veiled in a mantle of white, Eidos and Nemesis will forsake humankind, fleeing to join the deathless gods. And anguish and woe will be left for mortals, and there will be no more stay against evil. So that's a hopeful way to begin things. I'm going to read a couple of passages from Virgil's Georgics. Virgil, I do think that Virgil's, actually, we can talk about this more as we proceed over the course of this conversation, but I do think that both Virgil and Hesiod are very interested in the work of synthesizing disparate information, which we in our modern context might call interpretation. And so I'm interested in the toggling back and forth that these poems perform between instruction that is meant to create the conditions for improvement and the recognition that all our efforts against improvement may come to naught after all. So this is a passage from book 1 of Virgil's Georgics, where he talks about the harm that can be caused by storms. So the farmer has done all the diligence that he can. He has prepared his fields. He has been watching the signs from the heavens to figure out when is best to plant and when is best to bring in his harvest. But even all that diligence does not prevent catastrophe. And in book 1 of the Georgics, I think there's a catastrophe in each book of the Georgics, and the catastrophe from book 1 is this storm. So why tell of autumn's storms and stars, and now days draw in and summer softens? What keeps men to vigil now, or when spring falls in downpours, as the sheathed harvest needles through the field and grain on its green stem swells up with milk? Often, as the farmer guides the reaper to his golden tract and shears the barley from its crackling stalk, I have seen all the armies of wind clash, uprooting plump grain left and right from deepest roots and hurling it high. Then with its whirlwind black, the storm whisks the slight straw and airborne slips away. And often in the sky looms a tremendous host of waters. Clouds levied from the ether roll a murky squall of swart rains. Shelved heaven tumbles, and with its wet pounding washes off the lilting crop, the oxen's labors. The gutters fill, the gully swells with rushing, the sea seethes, its estuaries heaving. The Father himself, in his midnight of clouds, hurls with his fulgent fist the thunderbolt, at whose impact the earth's bulk trembles. Critters scatter, terror blasts all mortal hearts to cowering. He with lancing fires sunders Athos or Rhodope or the heights of Sarania. The south wind redoubles and the thronging rain. Now thickets, now shores moan beneath the savage gale. Fearing this, observe the months and heaven's constellations, where Saturn's frozen star runs retrograde, into which of heaven's orbits wanders Mercury with his fires. Above all, love the gods, and to exalted Ceres devote your yearly tribute, performed on the reviving grass as the last of winter falters at the crack of clement spring. Then lambs are fat and wine is mellow. Then sleep is sweet as shadows cluster on the peaks. Let every farmhand worship Ceres. For her, infuse the honeycombs with milk and well-aged wine, and thrice around the sprouts parade the blessed sacrifice, whom the chorus of your company trails with cordant jubilation, with cheers invoking Ceres to dwell beneath their eaves. Nor should any edge his sickle under the ripe ears before he wreathes his brow with sprigs of oak, spins an artless shuffle, and lifts his harvest hymn. Book 3's catastrophe in the Georgics has to do with, the third book of the Georgics, of course, has to do with animal husbandry. And the third book of the Georgic has its own particular cataclysm that comes upon the animals. After all your work making sure that your animals are well taken care of, you milk them at the right time, you put them in the right places, you breed them in season, and you breed them the right way, the right colors of animals with the right colors of animals. Nevertheless, what fells all that effort is this plague. So this is the plague section from book 3 of the Georgics. Once from a sickness of sky, there arose here a season pitiable, when the whole of autumn glared white hot. Each breed of cattle it sentenced to be slain, and all wild beasts. It defiled the lakes. It putrefied the fodder with its poison. Nor was the way to death unvarying, but when fiery through all the veins thirst had coursed and withered their stricken shanks, in turn a rheumy fluid bloated up and seeped itself into every bone, moldering cell by cell in disease. Often, in the middle of oblations for the gods, the victim waiting at the altar, the woolen fillet with its snow-white garland circling its brow, dropped dead among the dawdling ministrants. Or even if, before it succumbed, the priest slaughtered with his blade, neither did the altars blaze from the entrails laid upon, nor could the oracle implored return an explanation. Scarce the knife under throat sheened with blood, the sand darkened only surface deep with thin gore. Then everywhere among lilting grasses the calves fall dead and give up their dear lives beside well-stocked mangers. Then upon the fawning dogs comes madness, and a rasping cough shakes the weakening hogs and strangles them with their swollen gullets. The triumphant stallion dwindles and fails, neglectful of his zeal and of clover. He turns from the springs with frequent pawings raking the earth, drooped ears with which fitful sweat that runs cold near dying. His hide dries out, and hard beneath the hand resists handling. Such signs they give in the first days before death. But if in its advance the plague begins to fearson, then the blazing eyes, the wheeze racked up from deep within, sometimes freighted with moaning, their inmost guts wrenched with long sobs, black blood spurting from the nostrils, and the ragged tongue chokes the blocked throat. It seemed help to pour in wine juice through a horn in-crammed. It seemed the single balm for the dying. But soon this too was for ruin, for refreshed in rage they burned, And even under the droop of death, God deal the pious better, and such madness to our enemies, with bared teeth mangled their own broken limbs. And behold, the bull, steaming beneath the iron plow, collapses and vomits from his mouth blood mixed with foam and shudders his last groans. The plowman trudges disconsolate, unyokes the bullock mourning his brother's death, and abandons the plow wedged halfway through its work. No shade of deep groves nor soft pastures can stir his spirit, nor the river clearer than amber among the rocks tumbling hard for the plain, but his flanks utterly slack, and a stupor weighs his listless eyes. His neck slumps to the ground with sagging weight. What good his labor or his service? Why would the share upturn the heavy soil? And yet no Massic indulgence from the wine has worked such harm to them, nor banquets spread. They graze on leaves, on provender of simple grass. Their draughts are flowing springs and rivers lively coursing, and no worry breaks their wholesome dreams. But at no other time, they say, were cattle rounded up from the back country for Juno's offerings, and the processional, drawn by oxen wild, outsized to the exalted shrine. Thus men claw the earth with arduous rakes, and with their own fingernails drill in the seeds, and over the hilltops with strained necks drag the creaking wagons. The wolf scopes out no stratagems around the sheepfold, nor nightly prowls the flocks. A sharper care tames him. Timid stags and skittish does now drift among the hounds and around the village. The brood of the unfathomable sea and all the race of swimmers wash up along the shoreline like shipwrecked hulls upon the breakers, and the prodigious seals flee into the rivers. Now perishes the viper, unavailing his barricade in winding lair, and the water snake, stunned with scales bristling. The air is unkind to the very birds, and nosediving, they leave their life beneath the towering cloud. What's more, to move pasture is now no remedy. The therapies attempted work ill. The experts give up. Philyra's son Chiron and Amathaean's son Melampus. Loosed into light from Stygian gloom, ghastly Tisiphone rampages, driving plague and fear before her. And day on day, upstirring, rears her greedy visage higher. The streams and their thirsting banks and sloped hills repeat the bleating of flocks and their constant bellowing. Now she deals out slaughter in droves and heaps up in their very stalls the corpses decomposing with foul rot, until men learn to seal them up with dirt and bury them in pits. For neither could the hides be used, nor could anyone purge the vitals clean with water, nor contain it by bonfire. They could not even shear the fleeces, eaten through with fester and filth, nor touch the tainted yarn. For if anyone should but try on the malignant robes, fevered boils and vile sweat would run over his reeking limbs, and he would have no long hour to wait for the accursed fire to devour his infected flesh. So that is a warning to us all. That's a post-pandemic poem at this point, though it was not, I suppose, for me at the time. I'll read one more section from the Georgics. This is the passage. So in book four has to do with beekeeping, and there's the archetypal beekeeper Aristaeus, whose hive has failed, and he's trying to figure out why on earth his hive has failed. And so he goes to his mother, the nymph, can't remember what her name is off the top of my head, and she instructs him that he has to go ask Proteus why his hive has failed. So he asks Proteus, he has to go through all this kind of subterfuge. He hides out, he grabs Proteus and he holds him through all his changes, and then he finally gets Proteus to tell him the secret why Aristaeus's hive has failed. And he says that it's his fault that Orpheus has undergone this terrible ordeal. It is in fact not, it is punishment from the gods. And so this is the passage where Proteus tells the story to Aristeas of Orpheus. This is like a nested narrative. So Proteus says, "The wrath of no mean deity hounds you. You do penance for a sore offense. Heartbroken Orpheus stirs up these punishments against you, far less than you're deserving, and rages tormented for his wife reft away. Just so, headlong along the river that she might escape you, doomed girl. She didn't see the monstrous snake before her feet, hugging the banks in tall grass. The chorus of her companion dryads with wailing rimmed the mountain's peaks. The crags of Rhodope mourned, and Alpine Pangaea, the martial land of Rhesus and the Getae, the Hebrus mourned, and Oreithyia in the north wind's Attic bride. But he, consoling love's agony with his hollow shell lyre, sang you, sweet wife, you to himself on the lonely shore, you with the rising day, you at the day's decline. Even the jaws of Taenarus, the steep gates of Dis, the grove shrouded in black dread, he entered and approached the dead and their terrible king, and the hearts unversed in gentling to human prayers. But by his monody shaken from the deepest pits of Erebus came wispy shades and ghosts of those deprived of light, as many as the birds that by the thousand hide themselves in leaves when evening star or winter's sleet drives them from the mountains. Mothers and men, and emptied of life, the bodies of bold-hearted heroes, boys and unread maidens, and youths lain on the pyres before their parents' stairs. Around them the black mire and grotesque cattails of Cocytus, revolting swamp that binds them with sluggish water, and Styx winding 9 times around imprisons them. Why, the very halls were astonished, and death's inmost Tartarus, and the Furies with livid snakes braided in their hair, and Cerberus held agape his 3 mouths, and the spin of Ixion's wheel halted with the wind. And soon his steps retracing, he had dodged every pitfall, and Eurydice restored was coming to the upper air following behind. For that stipulation had Proserpina made, when a sudden madness seized him, reckless loving, truly forgivable, if hell knew to forgive. He stopped, and upon his own Eurydice, already at the very edge of light, forgetful, alas, and his judgment overthrown, he looked back. Instantly, all his labor fell apart, broken the pitiless tyrant's pact, and thrice thunder sounded over the pools of Avernus. She cried, "O Orpheus, what has ruined wretched me and you? What utter madness! Behold, again the cruel fates call me back, and darkness shrouds my swimming eyes. And now farewell. I am carried off, cloaked in endless night, stretching toward you helpless hands. Oh, yours no more," she cried. And sudden from his sight, like smoke mingling into thin air, vanished away. And as he clutched vainly at shadows, longing to say so much, she never saw him more, nor did the ferryman of Orcus let him cross that swampy obstacle again. What could he do? Where take himself, his wife twice snatched away? With what sobs could he move Hades? With what word its powers? Even now, she was floating cold as death in the Stygian raft for 7 whole months, month on month, they say, beneath a skyscraping cliff by desolate Strymond's wave. He wept, and under the frozen stars spun out this song, soothing tigers and enticing oaks with his dirge, as mourning beneath the poplar shade the nightingale laments her lost brood, which a rude ploughman spying ripped unfledged from their nest. She sobs night long, and on a branch perched her doleful song renews, and fills full the sphere with dreary plaints. No love nor any wedding song could bend his soul. Lonely, he would wander the Hyperborean ice, the snow-crusted Tanais, the steppes ever widowed by Ripaean frosts, wailing Eurydice wrested away and the gift of Dis annulled, by which devotion spurned, the Thracian dames amid their consecrated rites and midnight bacchant orgies tore the youth apart and scattered him across the field's expanse. Even then, while down the middle of its rapids, the Hebrus, river of his father's realm, swept and rolled, his head ripped from its marble neck. Eurydice, his mere voice and cold tongue were calling. Oh, poor Eurydice, as his spirit fled. Eurydice, the banks replied, the whole river long. It occurs to me that there are more episodes of kind of narrative expansion in Virgil's Georgics than there are in the works of Hesiod. There are very long passages of narrative expansion in the Hesiod, but it's less excerptable. So perhaps I'll stop and join you.
Sure, let's read a little bit more of the Hesiod.
Would you like me to read more?
Could you read another?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Do you need some water? I'm going to read while she runs outside. Let's see. Okay, so I read from the Works and Days before. It's hard to know where to begin. So Hesiod tells the story of Prometheus, who gets in trouble for many things. And in Hesiod's telling, he enrages Zeus by dividing the portions of offered meats incorrectly. So I'm just trying to figure out where is a good place to start. Let's see. How about here? Iapetus married a dainty-tread maiden, Clymene, daughter of Ocean, and ascended their nuptial bed. She bore him a strapping souled son, Atlas. She also bore illustrious Menoetios and Prometheus, with his intricate and shifty wit, and harebrained Epimetheus, who in the beginning brought harm upon bread-toiling men. For he took in the woman that purpose-built maiden from Zeus. Menoetius was mutinous, so far-sighted Zeus downcast him to Erebus, struck through with a smoking bolt for his purblind, reckless, and cocksure swagger. Atlas upholds vaulted heaven by harshest compulsion, with unwearying shoulders and head standing firm at the earth's outmost verge, near the clear-voiced Hesperides. This is his portion, ordained by wise Zeus. Twist-minded Prometheus, he fixed in yieldless fetters, unbreakable chains bored into a beam, and roused a long-winged eagle against him. It devoured his immortal liver, which nightly grew fully, as much as that day the wing-spreading bird had consumed. But Heracles, bold son of dainty-legged Alcmene, brought the bird down. He drove off its scourging torment and delivered the son of Iapetus from his distress. Olympian Zeus, who reigns on high, intended this, that the glory of Heracles born of Thebes might be greater than ever the bounteous earth over. Thus did he reverence and honor his eminent son, and though outraged, he relented the wrath he had harbored because Prometheus dared to match wits against almighty Zeus. For when gods and mortals were divided, disputing at Mecone, keenly he carved up a massive bull and plated out portions meant to dupe wise Zeus. On one side, he set meat and organs rich with fat, covered up with the hide and guts of the ox. On the other, he arranged the ox's white bones, cunning and artful, and covered them up with glistening fat. Then to Prometheus spoke the father of men and of gods. Iapetos' son, preeminent among lords, my friend, how unfairly you've shared out the portions. So censured Zeus, who discerns undying designs. But sly Prometheus smiled softly and answered, never forgetting his devious scheme, Zeus, glorious, greatest among eternal gods, choose whichever your inmost heart demands. So he spoke with a mind of guile. And Zeus, who discerns undying designs, saw the trick and understood, and in his heart contrived what trouble he would bring upon mortal men. With both hands he took up the fat's greasy whiteness, rage swarmed his soul, anger swept through his heart when he beheld the pale ox bones shrouded up in their humbug. Since then the race of men on earth burn white bones to the gods upon smoke-sweet altars. Cloud-rolling Zeus, thick with fury, addressed him. Iapetos' son, cleverest of wits, my friend, you haven't forgotten your tricks. So spoke angry Zeus, who discerns undying designs. And he ever remembered Prometheus's dupe. He gave not to mortals who dwell on the earth the power of fire unflickering in ashwood, but the noble son of Iapetos outwitted him and stole the beaconing flare of flickerless fire in the pith of a fennel stalk. Stung to his core was Zeus the high thunderer. His fond heart fumed to see among men fire flaring its beacon. Straight he made a calamity to requite men for fire. Out of clay framed the famous lame god of the furnace, a shamefast maiden in simulacrum, as Cronus' son commanded. And then we get into the Pandora story. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those readings, and I was really pleased to hear those particular passages, so that's very exciting. In fact, I'm sort of in the process of a Georgics right now, but it basically came out of the pandemic and looking at the plague and just thinking to myself, oh, well, you know, that also is a zoonotic plague, and let's look at that. And I started translating that particular passage, which I guess now with bird flu and so forth is kind of back upon us. And some of those images, like all of the fish being washed ashore, we saw in Greece this past summer in Volos, where like the entire bay was full of dead fish.
Was that because of hot water?
It's common.
Okay.
And my husband's a journalist, so I know more about this than maybe I need to know. I have a couple of questions that maybe we can go back and forth about or have a conversation. Like I might read a couple of short passages from similar parts of the poem.
You will.
Okay. You know, one of the things I think is, since we're both poets who are also verse translators, kind of what the relationship is between your practice as a poet of original poems and this process of verse translation. Are they flip sides of the same coin? Are they, how do you feel about them in relationship to each other?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm very curious to hear how you respond to the same question. For me, translation is much easier than writing original poetry because I don't have to figure out how it ends. That has been determined for some thousands of years. And so that frees me to be able to play with the texture of language and to play with syntax and to define music. I feel more at liberty to be linguistically inventive, I think, in translating than I do perhaps in my own work because I don't have to solve the problem of the resolution. How does that?
That makes a lot of sense to me. Is it Kenneth Rexroth who says translation frees us from our contemporaries? Is that? But I certainly feel that way. I mean, one of the problems of being a lyric poet in particular is not usually writing epics or so on. It's, you know, even if you were to write the best poem you've ever written today, you know, and you're like, I'm a genius. The next day, you're just faced with a blank page again, and you have to start from scratch, and all of that doubt comes in. But if you're working on a translation project, you can always go and you do your 20, 30, 40
Yes.
lines. 20 is good for me, but
5 a day, yeah, mine.
well, 20 is a very good day, and then there are days where it's like 2 lines, and then, I realize they're wrong. But I think it is this thing of you get to use all of the muscles and skills of being a poet. But you know where it ends, what you're going to cover and so on. And so that it is freeing, and also, you don't have to be stuck in your own voice. You can be a different gender or culture. It's very freeing, I think. So I like that you said the word free.
And one of the benefits of knowing where it ends, besides having the responsibility of solving whatever narrative might exist, taken from me, is that it heightens the act of interpretation that is always happening when you're writing. When we write, we are interpreting one thing, either experience or sensation, or in these circumstances, these texts. And the words you choose have very much to do with the other things that are going on in the text. And so being able to kind of consciously amplify the interpretive work of putting words on a page, I think is part of the benefit of doing verse translation.
And I'm sure many of you here are doing degrees in classics, or you're studying classics. My undergraduate and master's degree are in classics. But that thing of, if you're with a reading group, or, you're reading a text and you come across a crux of some kind, you can sort of discuss that, and you all kind of know what the problems are and the different interpretations. But if you're doing a verse translation, you have to make a decision. You have to come down on a reading. And sometimes it's a compromise, and you're aware of there may be these other readings, but you have to say, actually, no, I'm gonna go with, sometimes there's a textual issue. I'm gonna go with this. I like how you say somewhere, I think in your introduction, that you're not, you had a great phrase, which I'd like to steal. Something about you're not committed to any one text, or I forget the way you phrase that. But as a poet, I'm really going to use whatever editorial reading is most convenient and best for how it's going to sound in the English verse.
Yeah, and if you're working with texts that have a long tradition of being read and circulating, then there are competing versions of lines that have been in evidence in the public square for, sometimes hundreds or thousands of years. And in the work of the translator requires you to pick one.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you have to pick the same one.
I know everything. Sometimes
I really like how Wes does this, but I prefer that text over there.
So that's really fun. That's a fun aspect of it. I mean, with someone like Lucretius, the text is pretty consistent, but some others not so much. And what brought you to these texts? I mean, because again, this is sort of not the usual ones, that maybe the Georgics, but Hesiod is not. People don't seem to gravitate to him as much. I mean, I love Hesiod, but
yeah, I mean, the question is, in part, why would we read somebody from a couple millennia ago telling us how to do stuff? I think there's something consoling, comforting about the continuity of instruction over the course of years. Not that we are instructed in the same ways, but the urge to instruct. I really appreciate how you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, or at the top of the hour, that we still go in for didactic texts. We think of them differently. We might not admit to ourselves until today that watching, a home flipping show on television is a version of a didactic text, but it is in fact a version of a didactic text. And I think that there's something about problem solving that is appealing. I think that didactic texts offer or turn upon the principle that there's a set of problems, and here are some ways we are going to attempt or endeavor to manage the problems, to solve them, if only temporarily. And I think that both of these texts are self-aware about the way that solving problems is both a function of content and a function of readerly engagement. And I think that it maps very easily onto the work of literature. The work of literature is in part a problem-solving endeavor, where we are presented with a series of propositions and then we have to like work out how they will be stably communicated to a set of a disparate and unimaginable set of readers, you know?
And I think that idea of consolation, I mean, it is one of the reasons I think we go to these texts. I was translating Hesiod's works and days. I live in Greece during the economic crisis. And when I would be explaining to people what I was doing, I'm like, well, I'm translating this Greek poet. He doesn't live in Athens. He's kind of near Thebes. And he's in a lawsuit with his brother. And he's really concerned about, you know, issues of work and employment and, you know, corruption.
Yeah.
And, you know, the courts and, you know, their corruption. And people are like, oh, I think I know him. You know, do you live in Greece if you're not in a lawsuit with your brother over property? No. But I think also that sense of 8th century BC, you know, the world is going to hell in the handbasket and things used to be much better. So in a certain sense, the world has always been going to hell in a handbasket. Right. So there is something to that kind of the age I live in is the worst. I was gonna actually, if I may, read my version of the Iron Age
please
thing.
do.
It's really fun to hear your version and to think about like the choices. He's talked about the other ages. Would I were not among the fifth age, I'm torn. Would I be better dead or not yet born? For this age is an iron age indeed. Suffering never ceases for our breed. By day men toil, night worries them with care, and the gods will give them troubles hard to bear. But even so, some good things will alloy their lot of woe, and still Zeus will destroy this race when babes are born already gray at the temples, and when father in no way shall share a bond with sons, nor sons with father, nor guest with host, nor comrades with each other, nor brother love his brother as before. Soon men won't honor parents anymore, but will heap insults on old age. They'll learn about the payback of the gods in turn, ingrates for their own rearing. Lacking pity with the rule of fist, one sacks another's city. Thankless will be the man who keeps his word, the good and the just. The wicked will be preferred in honor. Outrageous men who take the law in their own hands, and there shall be no awe. The bad will harm the good. He won't be loath to twist his words and seal them with an oath. And spiteful envy with her evil eye and acid tongue will keep herself close by to every miserable man, while awe and retribution will indeed withdraw, abandoning mankind and their broad roads of earth for the Olympian abodes of the deathless ones, veiling themselves in white and hiding the beauty of their skin from sight. Dismal troubles will be left behind, no deliverance from evil for mankind. But this kind of, you know, that grumbling, growling things now are really bad. But also, I think there's often the sense of prophecy, like unless we change things, you know, this is how things are going to be. But there is this sense of, you know, but I'm going to tell you, Persea, my ridiculous brother, how to fix things and get out of the stock market and shape up.
Okay, so I have your reading prompts a question in me. You work in various verse forms. You have produced your works and days in rhymed couplets. Could we talk for a minute about the question of form?
I was gonna ask you about translation. Yeah, this is, I mean, I think this is one of the exciting or problematic or difficult things for the English poet is always, you know, how are we going to address particularly dactylic hexameter, which as most of you here probably know even better than I do, is a very flexible, stretchy line. Mm-hmm. So I think it can go from what 15 to 17 so much. It's something that I've got wrong. Anyway, they're very 13 to 17 syllables or something. I can't do that on the hoof. But so it's really quite stretchy. And so it's interesting to know like what kind of choices you make, and is it the same choice when you're doing the dactylic hexameter of Hesiod as opposed to Virgil or Lucretius? Or
Yeah,
so?
my Hesiod is much more dactylic. They are not in hexameters. I thought that it was, it's virtually impossible to write a dactylic hexameter line in English and make it be something that anyone wants to read. Nobody, it's just so, it's flabby and it's galloping and I don't know, I feel like you're like riding a horse across an endless plain. So that was not something that worked for me. So I had to come up with some analog that I felt I could sustain. And so mine is a rough accordion-like dactylic, but not 6. But I try to, as in Greek, make it possible so that the number of syllables in each foot is flexible, has that kind of looseness to it. And that allowed me to hit hard on a couple of syllables or to introduce a kind of breath's worth of pause into the foot. And I decided to do that in the Hesiod because with the Virgil, the syntax was so compelling to me that it governed my treatment of the words in translation. With Hesiod, the syntax was almost impossible to render in English, I found. I don't know if other people have tried to do it, but I could not render the syntax. So I needed some kind of structure to govern the text as it unfolded. Why do you turn to structure in translation?
Well, I don't think I could get through it otherwise. So.
Do you mean you'd be bored?
I think it pulls me along. So, I do understand the very reasonable objections against rhyming unrhymed text into English. And, I think Matthew Arnold has some very good things to say about that. Here's what I will say in favor of this is I think one of the things that's most important for contemporary readers to get is that these are poems.
Right.
So these are not prose treatises on farming or atomic theory or whatever. And for someone like Lucretius or Virgil, it's a little bit crazy to be doing this in verse. For Hesiod, that's the only thing, because prose hasn't been invented yet. Hesiod might have preferred prose, but it hadn't been invented, so he has to do it in verse. And I really think that, not sure how much the average reader even hears blank verse, but they hear rhyme for sure. And there's a little bit of rhyme at the beginning of Works and Days actually, but that may not be Hesiod. Maybe not according to Persea. But I will say this about rhyme. I don't think it has to be like a closed couplet. So I think Matthew Arnold's objection is, the syntax and so forth should be spilling forward, and a couplet is closed. But a couplet doesn't have to be syntactically closed. It's simply closed from the sound. But I don't feel it is closed. I feel it's more a concatenation.
Right.
And it's sort of drawing you onto the next line. I feel that way with particularly the Latin syntax. 2 lines are often so syntactically entangled that the rhymed couplet is maybe not the worst thing. I'm making my pitch. This is my spiel because I am aware that people might object. In both, in when I'm doing Virgil, Hesiod, or Lucretius, I have not fetishized doing the line for line. I know that that's supposed to be the gold standard. But I also think that's kind of arbitrary. I think if you kind of break out of that, you can allow for a much more natural reading and not, squeezing out an epithet or padding the line if you kind of allow it to breathe a little in English. So I am not concerned. I'm translator reviewers love to say this is a line by line translation, which is great if you've got, you're looking at the original and you want to follow along exactly. But I'm not too worried about that. So
it's also the case that not a ton of readers are going to be like, oh, thank goodness I can check this against the Latin.
Right.
This room accepted.
Right.
The standard person in a bookstore is not going to be like, oh, I need to consult, what's the vocabulary word they're in? in the Greek, you know, so I think that that's. I also think that what you've described, you said concatenating, it makes for, it produces a kind of tension, I think, between the structural closure and the logical unfolding. So the sentence continues to pull you along, even as the kind of the sound suggests that you have reached the end of something, and that being able to be elastic across that tension, I think, is one of the, it characterizes your translations, but it also characterizes your work in English.
I mean, I think like with the Hesiod, it was kind of fun. You were talking about like landing on certain syllables. So with the Hesiod, I particularly kind of enjoyed getting really important words in those load-bearing rhymes. So because it's like work and shirk, toil and soil. I mean, they were just there. You know, kind of, and it was a way of kind of reinforcing the messages of the poems where the rhyme word.
Yeah.
I wanted to get twerk. You know, when that tight skirt woman goes by, but I pulled it back.
It's very funny. I was thinking about, you were talking about line by line translation versus a kind of more free, holistic approach to translation. I think that one of the things that makes me excited as a reader of not just poetry in Greek or Latin, but poetry generally, is the flexibility of the sentence. And I think that poetry is the one, perhaps the one place in English language writing that we expect and are not frustrated by disrupted syntax. And I love disrupted syntax so much. And so when I produce a translation, I'm not necessarily committed to going line by line because it is what the world of translation expects from me, but rather it's a puzzle, right? Like, how can I make this make sense and reproduce as closely as possible the experience of coming upon these words and being surprised by what's next as I'm reading through. The experience of, I think that the surprise of syntactical unfolding is an undersung virtue of poetry generally, and it's an undersung virtue of poetry that's ancient that we access in translation, because so many readers access these ancient texts through the mediation of an Englishing. So I am interested, I'm really trying to see, is it possible to give that same sense of surprise as I move through a line?
I love that idea of puzzle, because I do sometimes feel that it's like I'm working on a crossword puzzle for which I am not sure there is an answer. I mean, there's that wonderful feeling when you do hit on the answer, like, yes, oh my gosh, but then sometimes you're like, there is no answer and I'm gonna have to invent a new crossword puzzle, like, to get to that thing. So there is that sense. I mean, I guess that's one of the things that also, for me, about the rhyming, which, you know, is my tick or whatever, is that it makes me have to look at larger syntactical units. Where I have to say, okay, you know, I need to look at all of the places where maybe I need to land on a rhyme or not, and like, where do I put this and how does this unfold, as you say, and that maybe that element of surprise and tension, which is so fun.
I'm so glad you said that it feels to you like a crossword puzzle, because it gives me the opportunity to confess the origins of this translation project, which were that I was working on my dissertation and I had an infant son, and I, like, at the end of the day, my brain was done. I just could not think anymore about anything that felt consequential. And I was like, how can I get my brain into language? How can I stay in the realm of language without having to produce or to figure out the argument? And so that was what I did instead of crossword puzzles. I would open up a few, 4 lines of Latin and be like, oh, how can I arrange?
Have you read, so the first person to English Lucretius, although it wasn't published until like 1980, is Lucy Hutchinson.
Yes.
Who is the wife of the regicide from the English Civil War. And she translated this partly because she was overhearing, people talk about Lucretius, obviously Protestants talking about it in a very, like this is godless, whatever. And she wanted to understand it, but her description of how she worked on it, which she describes working on her translation of Lucretius in the room where the several tutors of her children were putting them through their paces, and she would number the syllables of her translation to go along with her needlework.
What?
So it's like very feminine work kind of thing of this. There's something you can do while other things are happening in the room, maybe.
Huh,
That's a sort of
that's
interesting idea.
fascinating. And it also, aligns with what would have been expected for her or allowed to her at that period of time, right? Translation was a work that was in the 16th and 17th century encouraged for women because it didn't tax their poor little brains. All they were doing was edifying themselves by like learning fully from the classic, from the great masculine classic.
Although she was probably unusual in her excellent Latinity. And there's also, what's really fun if you ever get a chance to look at this translation is where she goes off piste with Lucretius. So for instance, where there's a puddle of water where you can see deep into the sky as far as whatever, she, as an English gentlewoman of that time period, can't imagine a 1-inch puddle of water, so it's like 2 feet deep or something in the road. And then there with the very sexy bits, that are all about sexual positions and whatever, she just like omits and she says, this would be better for a midwife to translate. Like clearly she can understand it, but she's like, can't go there.
I love that. I love that.
Anyway, maybe we should open up for some questions.